The University of Minnesota Twin Cities respectfully acknowledges that the land we are on today is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Dakota people. The University of Minnesota is founded as a land-grant institution, and we recognize that our founding came at a dire cost to the Dakota people. The Dakota were forced to cede their lands in return for goods and services, but the United States government did not uphold the terms of those treaties, which led to widespread devastation. We recognize this painful past, and we honor Dakota people's history on this land. We honor their sovereignty, and we honor their continued contributions to our region. The word Minnesota comes from the Dakota name for this region, Minnesota Makoche, the land where the waters reflect the skies. The Dakota and numerous other indigenous peoples whose cultural, spiritual, and economic practices are intrinsically woven into this landscape hold this land sacred. We recognize them as the original stewards of this land and all the relatives within it, relatives who had thriving and vibrant communities prior to disruption by settlers. Today, the state of Minnesota shares geography with 11 tribal nations. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm tribal sovereignty and hold the University of Minnesota accountable to recognize and counter the historical and contemporary injustices that continue to impact Indigenous people. We will do this through mutually beneficial partnerships, research, policies, and practices that respect indigeneity. I'd like to welcome all of you. I'm Ann Waltner. I am no longer the chair of the history department. Sarah Chambers is now chair, but I'm substituting for her tonight as host for this wonderful event. And I believe this may be the first time we've had two alumni in conversation with one another. We've sometimes had an alum in conversation with a faculty member, but tonight we have two alums speaking to one another. The subject of this book club meeting is Tom Taylor's book, Modern Travel in World History, which was published by Routledge in 2022. Tom is an associate professor at Seattle University. I believe he received his PhD in 1988, and Mary Jo Maines was his advisor. He will be in conversation with Lauren Crabtree, who studied modern China here at the university. And in fact, I believe that all of Lauren's degrees are from the University of Minnesota. His PhD is in history and Asian studies. He spent much of his career at Colorado State, and then he went to the University of Tennessee, where he was vice president and provost of the University of Tennessee system, and he was chancellor of the Knoxville campus. And what Tom and Lauren have in common specifically is a commitment to the semester at sea. I think probably more broadly, what they have in common is a commitment to history and to ideas about travel, but the semester at sea is sort of what brings them together. And you actually met at a semester at sea orientation meeting. So I think without my talking any more about you, I will turn the floor over to you, Tom, and let you begin to tell us a little bit about your book. I said I was going to stop talking, and now I'm not going to stop talking. Most of you know what the process is. When you get questions, put the questions in the chat. I will ask Tom or maybe Lauren or maybe both of them to answer the questions. And that's how we will proceed for the next hour. So now, Tom, you may have the floor.
Great, thanks, Ann. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate the history department and Sarah for thinking of inviting me. Clayton, I want to thank you for organizing this and doing all the logistics. And Ann and Lauren, I appreciate very much your hosting me and willing to be part of this. So I thought I would start by as I see at least names of many old friends and colleagues that go back to my grad school days. to try to give you a sense of how this book came about. And then just a very, very brief overview of sort of the structure of it. And then Lauren and I can sort of jump into some conversation. So, excuse me. I think the book is in many ways a sort of culmination for me of my intellectual journey. I was at Minnesota in the 80s. Mary Jo Maines was my advisor, and as Ann said, I got my dissertation in 88 in German social history. I got hired at Seattle U. I came out here to a department in transition, and I pretty quickly found myself sort of taking on areas that were not necessarily my primary fields. I wound up teaching Northwest history, for example. The department was in transition. I became a chair, and as I became a chair, I wound up hiring a number of new faculty, and I began to learn their fields, and I began to really develop a comparative aspect that I would really say I got its foundation with at the University of Minnesota, working with MJ, with Russ Menard, and a number of other names I can see. A great faculty that really got me to think comparatively and cross-culturally, I think, was the foundation for all this. At Seattle, I wound up becoming chair almost immediately, and that led to curriculum revisions. And when I did, I embraced the idea that we had to move out of an old Western Civ model and into a world history model. The question was, personally, how was I going to do that? And at the end of the day, travel became my entree into how to begin to think about doing world history. For me, travelers allowed me to engage cross-cultural dialogue and understanding that is essential for I think, teaching world history. Travel narratives, travel journals, travel letters, the wide variety of sources that we have about travelers allows me to think about the methodology and how we think about teaching the discipline of history. And for me, that was particularly important because part of the curriculum revision at Seattle U was trying to think through two courses, one world historiography and the other what that we call workshop in world history, which is a methodology course based in a world history focus. That teaching anyway was really the foundation for me to really begin to think about how to do world history, to engage world history. And then travelers became that. Travelers, to me, not only provide a rich methodology and historiography, but they're engaging. Their stories, the wide variety of people that travel, where they go to, where they came from, what they see. And the other thing I would say about it is, I, as a confirmed Brodelian, in sort of my view of history, when I go to Paris, I go to see Brodel's grave, not Jim Morrison's grave, in Père Lachaise. His focus on doing total history, his focus on thinking about how environment, how geography, how the layers of sort of materiality influence the practical stories or the event history, as he says. I think travelers are a good way to bring that all together in a very sort of multicultural way. And it was through that sort of evolution that over the last 20 years, I've really focused on travelers in a variety of ways. And this book is the culmination of that. The book itself is called Modern Travel in World History. It's part of a Routledge Themes in World History series and edited by Peter Stearns. And I want to thank Peter for helping sort of think about this project and inviting me to sort of work on it. The series itself is designed to be accessible, readable, concise, either supplements or concise textbooks in the world history field. And so that's sort of the structure of it. Basically, I designed it in the modern world for three themes. The first major theme is the development of technology. So the book itself starts in the 15th century, thinking of ocean travel, thinking of the Chinese treasure fleets, the emergence of the Atlantic voyages and Columbus and the Columbian Exchange, It then moves into the 19th century in technology in the steamships and trains and the bicycle as a vehicle of revolution. Then it moves in the 20th century to planes and cars and their impact. And then it sort of ends with at least a whimsical sort of thinking about the possibilities of space travel, and space tourism that's sort of emerging out there. Well, I'm interested in the technology of travel, but also how technology relates to political, cultural, and social decisions about how it's used and ultimately how it's appropriated. So it's not just technology in and of itself in terms of that. A second major theme is mass movements of people, the Atlantic slave trade, immigration, global migration, the refugee crises of the modern world. As I look at each of them, I'm interested in sort of the history of ordinary people and how they live in these extraordinary times. But it also helps me sort of think through questions of sources and methodology. How do we understand the stories of immigrants? How do we understand the stories of refugees? What kinds of sources do we have to sort of think about telling their stories? And then the last part of the thematics of the book are the stories of individual travelers. And I use those in some ways to try to bring this historical narrative to life. Some of them you would be well known, right? I mean, Columbus is in there. Maya Angelou is in there. Theodore Herzl is one of those characters. But as a social historian and really interested in everyday history, I also try to bring in people that are not as well known. One of the characters, for example, is a guy named Jan Kozlowski, who as a teenager had to flee the Russian Revolution and escape for 2 years across the Trans-Siberian Railway, looking for safety and ultimately finding immigration in the United States. Another story is the story of Thomas Stephen, the first guy who rode his bicycle around the world, and what that portended in terms of issues of modernization and cross-cultural engagement. When I do those, I always sort of think of one of my favorite historians, not at the University of Minnesota, is Tony Andrade. And Tony has sort of coined the phrase global microhistory. And he said the goal of global microhistory, as he said, is to capture and illuminate transnational themes through the lens of ordinary experiences. He argued that such a focus makes the global aspect comprehensible, but it also can help us understand the humanity and the importance of events. And he implored us, as he said, let's bring the history of our interconnected world to life, one story at a time. And I hope my book sort of at least helps address Tony's call. So that's sort of my background and sort of theme in a nutshell. Lauren, the ball's in your court, I think.
Glad to try to follow up well on what you said, Tom. I spent a lot of time with Tom's book over the last couple of weeks, and I just commend it to you if you haven't read it yet. His writing is tight, it's clear, and it's sparse. And it gets right to the themes that he intends for us to learn from this great little book. And so I think you would enjoy it if you haven't already read it. Just to give you a sense of me, one of the reasons I enjoyed this book so much is because it replicates my experiences a little bit anyway. When Tom talked about bicycles as an instrument of modernization and change in the late 19th century, it really resonated with me because I was in Beijing when it was all bicycles and hordes of them, all colored the same, all black. And how in the world could they tell which one was which? Somehow it worked. But that was a level of modernization at a pretty early level in China. Then I was in Vietnam and it was a motorcycle stage of modernization. And you took your life in your hands when you went to the streets. And I learned quickly that you never look at a motorcyclist, you just move ahead straight and they'll take care of you in a good sense. So bicycles, motorcycles, autos, all kinds of modernization things in the 19th and 20th centuries. And we've all gone through them in some way or other. Tom and I talked briefly, actually we exchanged emails just today. How in the world are we going to get into this book? And it's difficult because it's a global history book and there's everything in the world to talk about. And so we picked up on a couple of ideas. One was perhaps we might want to talk in terms of technology about the great turning point in Asian history and world history when the Ming Dynasty brought a halt to its global voyages, huge ships, unparalleled in the world at that time. And Anne knows this better than I do. She's a Ming historian. But then in, I believe it was, what year was it? 1433? The Ming Dynasty ended these great voyages of exploration, took them to the coast of Africa, up and down all over Asia. They were giant ships, dwarfing Columbus's ships of a later time. And my question is, why did they stop? And the usual explanation is the Chinese emperor said, and Anne can contradict this if she would, that he saw nothing of worth in the rest of the world that China didn't already have. So he brought those voyages to a conclusion. That, I think, was a critical turning point in world history. So I'd like Tom just to ruminate about that a bit. It is technology, for sure. It's transportation. It's the modern world, or what might have become the Chinese world, which maybe we're seeing become at long last in our time. Who knows for sure? But Tom, you want to respond to that? I could rattle on and on, but you're the expert here.
Sure. So, I mean, and Ann, feel free to jump in too. I mean, I think it's fascinating at a lot of levels, right? I mean, the early 1400s, China had these massive fleets that sailed across the South China Seas, through the Straits of Malacca, throughout the Indian Ocean. Famously, in I think the sixth voyage, they went to the east coast of Africa. They brought back giraffes that for a while, I guess as long as they survived, lived in the Forbidden City as sort of an emblem of the unicorn at one level, and sort of, but then these massive fleets were brought into port in Nanjing and left to sit there and rot. And not only were they called home, the emperor down the road burned the records of the voyages. There's only one diary from I think the sixth voyage that we have a fairly complete diary. And you know, and then passed laws that the Chinese were not to build ships that could go out into the ocean, right? So to me, when we think of technology and its role in shaping modern travel, it's the decisions, the cultural, the political, the social decisions that lead to the use of that technology. What Columbus and the Portuguese had could get across the oceans, but it was far inferior simply from the level of technology. Columbus had about 150 people on the three ships. I've actually toured a replica of the Nina when it was in Seattle. It's, you know, it's tiny, right? I mean, the treasure fleets had 20 to 30,000 people in these massive ships. So the cultural decisions. So travel is not only about the technology of what was technologically possible, but the social and cultural and political decisions behind that. And it had to do with shifting ideas on borders, the border in the north, the Great Wall, but it had to do with cultural decisions around Confucianism and Confucian ideas. It had to do with the positionality, and Anne would know this better than me, of the emperor in some ways as a foreign population versus the sort of, you know, the Confucians that were running the bureaucracy. So it's a great window, I think, into many things to think about the technology. And let me just sort of add one other quick, Lauren, because I think you sort of alluded to it. To me, it's also fascinating that in 2015, a colleague of mine at Seattle U, we took some students to China and we visited the museum of the treasure fleet that's now been reconstructed in Nanjing. And I think it, without trying to go too long on. It's a fascinating look about how China is rethinking its position as a global power and sort of resurrecting the idea that they once were a global power in the 1400s and using that as a way to think about their own development of a fleet and their position throughout the China Seas today. So the history 600 years ago is really playing into sort of the political and geopolitical sort of decisions of the current government.
It's all fascinating. And Tom used it, I think in the book, uses the term that technology is a two-way street, and it benefits and it causes difficulty. I suspect that the Ming emperors were a bit ethnocentric for sure, but they must have thought that there would be something that might indeed erode their authority if the massive ships brought back too much news of the outside world. In any case, technology goes two ways. Tom and I have been on ships at Semester at Sea, and one of the major supporters of that is the Tong family from Hong Kong and Taiwan. And there is a nice model of these ships in one of the, I think it's at Fudan University in Shanghai. And the Tong family created that model so students there would have an understanding perhaps of what China did at one time. So there is that technology piece. There is, of course, the political piece. And now we could jump to today's world if we wished and talk about China creating the world's largest navy, and it has done so. It doesn't have the same amount of firepower that the American Navy has, but it has many more ships and different kinds of firepower. So the connection is there in technology for the Chinese now, and clearly they are in the business of asserting their authority, not just in the East China Sea or the South China Sea, but indeed in the seas of the Pacific and the Indian Ocean and beyond. So this is not an idle book. It takes us into world history today.
Lauren, could I jump in there? Because it reminds me, I mean, I also in the book, I teach at a Jesuit university, but I have a chapter on the Jesuits, not only because I teach at a Jesuit university, but they were, as one historian argued, I think probably the most important institution in the early modern world for a lot of reasons. So I tell the story of Matteo Ricci going. All of you at the University of Minnesota know that his Mappamundos is in the James Ford Bell Library, one of the great collections of maps in the world. When I happened to be in Beijing, and Ann, it may have been the same year that we were in China together for the World History meeting. There's a Jesuit center in Beijing, and I was touring that, and we were sort of thinking of opening up a relationship there. When we were talking to the director of this, a Jesuit priest, he said, "I have to stop. We have some officials coming in." And it turned out that these were Chinese government officials. And what they wanted to see was the Jesuit maps from the time of Matteo Ricci. And what they were hoping is that what those maps proved is China had always been part of the China Seas, that the islands and the areas had always been Chinese. And so, Matteo Ricci, as a traveler who then did these maps to try to sort of get the Chinese to think about their place in the world after they had begun to shut the doors to the outside world a little bit more, sort of resonates again within the modern world and how those maps are now part of an effort by the Chinese to kind of rethink their own place in the world, if you will.
And to magnify their place in the world.
Yeah.
Certainly since about 2010, 11, the Chinese have been asserting themselves as never before. So there are connections here, and it's delightful that Tom's book deals with this. I would be a little critical by saying not of the Jesuits themselves, but of the fact that Tom didn't put much effort into, not much information into the book about Protestant missionaries. They were Johnny-come-latelys, for sure, 19th century. But however, my doctoral dissertation was on the China Christian colleges. And so If I had a moment of criticism, that would be it, Tom. But forget that. My wife said, it's not your book after all. And she's right. But I was struck by that.
Yeah. Well, let me just say, I mean, I think the series is designed to be concise, which is both a blessing and from a writer's standpoint, it's a curse. I mean, this is actually through a whole series of other stories, a kind of derivative of a much larger project that I had sort of been working on for a long time. That was a world history textbook, and there's lots of reasons why textbooks in history are not selling as much these days. But it was I had a 1,500-page textbook that included more of these kind of things. So I'm proud of what I've done in this book, but you have to make decisions about what stories you can tell. So if I get a second edition, I'll keep that in mind, Lauren.
You should not. I'm so aware that historians sometimes, when writing book reviews, will say this is a good book, but it's not the book I would have written, and then proceed to say why it's not the book. And that's foolishness. But that's sometimes what happens in the scholarly world. I think another interesting topic, there's so many interesting topics, and Tom is right. If you've tried to teach world history, or if you did what Romain Taylor and others did in the department some years ago, they wrote a 2-volume world history of Asia, and it's a marvelous effort. It's indeed too tough for undergraduates, I would put it that way, but it was a tremendous effort of putting together almost all the information we had, or at least the critical information, but it's a massive task. I wonder if we might talk a little bit, Tom, about the Columbian Exchange. You spend a good bit of time in the book on that. It has, of course, it's a derivative of Columbus's voyages, but also all the European voyages. And would you talk about what they were, when they were, what the consequences were for Europe, and what the consequences were for South America and ultimately North America?
Yeah. Speaking of concise, I will try to, but I think it's important, this book is about travelers, but, travelers carry a lot of things, right? They carry their cultural assumptions, right? But the ships carried plants and animals, right? I mean, they carried germs and viruses and, I think the work has been out there a while, but I think for students to hear it is absolutely critical to understand that, that the opening up of the Atlantic world was about Columbus as an individual, but it was also about the religion that he was traveling with. But it was also about the germs, the smallpox, the flu, and I think those stories, Lauren, resonate very strongly in the world that we live today, right? I mean, you start talking about the Columbian Exchange, you talk about people that had not been exposed to what had at one level not been catastrophic diseases back in Europe. All of a sudden we're wiping out populations, 80-90% of those populations in short periods of time because of the flu, because of the common cold. COVID helps us understand, that travel brings not only the people, but all these other kind of things with it, right? And the other thing I would just simply add about the Columbian Exchange, I mean, it is a two-way street in a sense that what the plants, the animals that came from the Americas fundamentally transformed the European world. When you tell the story of migration in the 19th century, you have to, in my view, tell the story of the Irish potato famine. And you have to understand the potato as a crop, as its source of nutrition and what it meant when the blight hit it in the 1840s. But, if you think of the Americas, if you think of the American West, defined by cattle and horses, those were animals that were brought by Europeans, right? If you think of the sugar plantations that led to the Atlantic slave trade, that sugar came from plantations that had slowly made their way across into the Mediterranean and then into the west, you know, the western coasts of Africa and into the Americas. The Columbian Exchange remade the world environmentally, ecologically, and culturally. And so that's one reason why the book sort of starts with that as its sort of beginning story.
Guns, Germs, and Steel, as one author put it, famous author. And goodness, the technology, then the medical catastrophes, the health catastrophes, and we can bring it up to date today. There was just a finding by the Department of Defense, I believe, that the COVID pandemic did originate in Wuhan, but they have low confidence about that. We still don't know where it came from, really. But there's another instance of pandemics, flu, and all of that reshaping the world in important ways.
Yeah.
And travel, we could jump now, I suppose. I don't think, I'm afraid I'm jumping more than you are, Tom, but I would just got back from an overnight flight, and I've not been sick at all for the past 3 years. And guess what? On that overnight flight, I picked up a cold, and it's now giving me fits. That's one of the problems of flying these days. You can't really protect yourself, and you don't know what bugs are lurking in those supposedly very clean airplanes. So this is a problem. It's something that we're going to have to cope with the rest of our lives, and I'm afraid for the rest of the centuries. So Tom,
Well, Lauren, and I would just add, I mean, quick, you know, in the chapter on the early 20th century, right? I mean, I talk about World War I, the massive importation of labor and soldiers that are brought in to fight from Africa to India, to the Chinese laborers in the hundreds of thousands that come, you know, to Europe. But then, of course, the point of that for the Columbian Exchange is the Spanish flu that, you know, kills, you know, I've seen estimates from 50 million to 100 million people globally in a year and a half, you know, and it helps us understand that travel always, in some ways, is part of that biological exchange that's an essential part of the world history story as well.
Absolutely. And one can reflect on one's own background. My dad was a World War I soldier, arrived in France in December of 1917 and fought in all those miserable battles in 18. I wondered from time to time, did he see Zhou Enlai? Zhou Enlai was there. Did he see Ho Chi Minh? Ho Chi Minh was there. Now that just, again, to bolster your point, Tom, is that so many people came through Europe as a consequence of World War I, and of course, then they carried the bug back with them too. And so travel is a chancy thing, and it kills a lot of people, as a matter of fact, as we see. Well, that's a Columbian Exchange. I'm fascinated, Tom, that you had I'm sorry, we didn't agree to talk about this, but your treatment of the Ottomans is really very good. I don't know Middle Eastern history, or what we would call West Asian history, very well, but the Safavids in Iran, and then of course the Mughals in India, 3 massive empires, and you bring that alive in your treatment of the Mughals especially, and of the Ottoman Empire, through the stories you tell in that book. And so it is probably, for me, the least known part of the world for me. And I don't know how your students would respond to that, but I think they'd respond very well, because your stories are so fascinating about that area. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, hey, thank you. Yeah, let me try to capture a few of them. You know, it's you know, I was thinking in terms of the Ottomans. I mean, people have probably heard of Lady Wortley Montagu. So one of the stories is, you know, the wife of a British diplomat that goes to the Ottoman world, and becomes the window into, you know, the women's life, et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, I mean, it's also important to understand, you know, that Ottoman travelers went to Europe as well, right? So, you know, and, you know, I tell the story of I'm getting the wrong guy's name out there now. Ilya Shalaby, who was called the greatest Ottoman traveler of all time. As a young man, he grew up and he had a dream. And he basically, I don't have the quote exactly right, but he had sort of been asking Allah for help. And he sort of mistranslated his dream, and Allah told him to travel. And so rather than simply go on the Hajj, he spent the next 40 years of his life wandering and traveling. But he became a soldier during the period of Ottoman expansion. He became a diplomat that became highly sort of solicited by the British and French, who were trying to find sort of avenues to take on the Habsburgs. And I use his story to help us understand the global empire in some ways that the Ottomans really was at this point in time. I didn't get a chance to put it into this book, but if you ever get a chance to read about him more, he has a great section in his like 10-volume travel log of Istanbul. And he actually has it sort of during when all the guilds went to parade before the emperor in Istanbul. And it's the most marvelous social history of life within this fascinating city. So he gives us an insight into many aspects of the Ottoman world. And just one other story with that, then I also sort of finished that section on the Ottomans, and it's actually by a preface to a travel book that was written in, I think, like 1870 or 1880. And the editor of this book, and it's a travel book about an Ottoman traveler going somewhere, but it's really a manifesto to say that the Ottomans began to need to travel, and not just simply travel for religious purposes. So much of Ottoman writing was about the Hajj, right? About, the Riyadh sort of works. But he's saying that the Ottomans need to begin to travel to look at culture, to look at technological innovation, to look at all the other things as a way for the Ottomans to sort of rethink their place within the world, which of course is in the state's view is crumbling at that point in time. Greece has become independent. Serbia is sort of broken away, et cetera, et cetera. So you can sort of use Shalaby and then this manifesto as sort of windows into Ottoman expansion, and then the sort of cultural crises that was coming and political crises that was in the mid-19th century around the Tamizat reforms. So that I try to use the Ottoman travelers to sort of look at that arc of Ottoman history, if you will.
That brings up another thought as I was trying to learn your book, and that is the role of biography. And when you talk about using writers and that sort of thing, that brought to mind Mark Twain, who was one of the original writers of travel books. And I think when you use people, as you've done in this book, it brings the periods to life, it brings the issues to life. And so I think that's been a spectacular part of your book. It's just important. It's so hard to get students to understand the great movements of history, but if you personalize it as you've done, I think it's very effective.
Well, thanks. I mean, that is definitely one of the goals of the book. Travelers became a window. People like to travel, and history is often vicarious travel, right? I mean, so at one level, there's just that, but they are humans, right? They're people. Their travels are often about the same foibles and experiences that we have, so they give windows into everyday life. Right? I mean, sleeping in hotels and it's raining out and it's miserable and the food is bad. You can sort of get, the everyday life, but they're also part of a larger narrative. And Lauren, the other thing for me, I sort of tried to talk about it in my introduction, using travelers opens up this marvelous methodology of how do we read these different kinds of sources, right? We've got letters from Indian soldiers in World War I that we know we have because the British took these letters from the soldiers. Censorship was part of this. How do we read through these to try to get an experience of that soldier, right? So, from a subaltern sort of viewpoint, how do we try to understand the voice of those where we don't often have that direct narrative? But yet Twain, because he was so popular in the 19th century, and actually his most popular work was his travel work, right? I mean, that's where he made the bulk of his money. So it's also not only about him and understanding him, it's about how his travel writing reveals a broader conception of the US at the time, about its place in the world, about its relationships at a time in which the US is expanding, right? So travel literature can be a broader window into a whole series of things as well. And let me add, Lauren, just quick, because I know we had sort of mentioned this, right? In places I use fictional travel, Jules Verne, or Montesquieu's The Persian Letters, or Jonathan Swift, right, and Gulliver's Travels, because in some ways, fictional travel was more important to shape cultural discussions, but it was often based on other travelers, right? So Voltaire, when he's writing, was very influenced by the Jesuits in China. So you sort of see a kind of, a historiography of how these works get used and reinterpreted in different contexts and places as well.
Good point. One thing you talk about a good bit is the Atlantic slave trade, the 4 centuries of that, and the fact that we don't have many sources from the Black perspective. And can you talk about what that does to our understanding of the slave trade, and can it be remedied, and are these sources to be found?
Yeah, I mean, the basic narrative of that chapter is, 12 to 13 million sort of, people were taken out of Africa and forcibly transported across the Atlantic in the 400 years of the slave trade. Historians would say we have probably what we'd call even reasonable firsthand accounts of maybe a dozen of those slaves. And so how do you even try to tell the story of what that experience was when the math is 12 million, it's 1 million to 1, literally, of these narratives. So we really have to both mine those narratives, but the other thing I try to do in that chapter is what other sources are out there. And I know a lot of historians would be very familiar with this. There's been a marvelous work over the last 30 or 40 years to collect the logs of the slave ships themselves. And it was a project that started in Harvard and is now very national, multi-institutional. But we have something like the records of 90% of the slave ships, the logs. And we can try to use, in the chapter, I try to think about what stories do these numbers tell? How do we take the data of slaves bought here, slaves sold here, some of those records, et cetera, and how do we try to tell a story of human beings through those kinds of logs and numbers? So to me, it goes back, one of the reasons I'm interested in travel is how travel opens up so many questions of historical understanding and methodology. And to me, what I try to do in the book is not only use travelers to tell the story of the past, but how historians try to engage and understand how we've come to know those stories. And so I think that's a chapter that tries to do that very explicitly.
I think at this point, it's probably a good idea to open it up
Sure.
to questions. And there are 2 questions that have been posted in the chat that I think are very relevant to what you've just now been saying. The first is, what is a traveler? And I mean, I have to admit, I have not read the book, but from the way you've been talking, it sounds like you have a chapter on the movement of slaves in the book on travel. And can you talk a little bit about how you think about slaves as travelers, and what is a traveler?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an excellent question. And the short version for me is a traveler that moves from one place, sort of one home, if you will, and goes to another place. Sometimes they go for a short period of time and they come back, right? Explorers are often thought of as travelers, and they certainly are, and legitimate. But sometimes travelers do not go, as I sort of see Steve Hindle, my old roommate, sort of pop in there, are not voluntary, right?
Mhm.
I mean, one other, so travelers are those that move through different places, and those places can be physical places and different countries, right? Different continents. But I had a debate anyway, and maybe this will help. And he actually stayed in the book with Peter Stearns, the editor of this, because in the chapter, one of the last chapters, I tell the story of Nelson Mandela. And he goes, he's not a traveler. The title of his autobiography is My Long Walk to Freedom.
Mm.
And the point of that is his travel was a travel of consciousness, a travel of sort of political reform and rethinking his worldview. And at the end of the day, the central part of his journey, if you will, is from Robben Island to Cape Town, which is basically 6 miles or something like that. But I think it's a very legitimate story about travel, because he had to move out of a world that was a world of prison and his caretakers, and move into a different world and help bring that new world into a post-apartheid world. So travelers for me fit a lot of different modes, I guess. Like I say, I use fictional travel at times, because I think even if they're not actual people, their journeys reveal a lot about the society and what was going on at the time, right? I mean, Jules Verne was the most popular writer of the late 19th century, and he remains an incredibly important person to get people to think about travel. And science fiction as a genre is often about travel and what it portends about society, about a culture, about modernization more broadly. And so I think I try to use travel to capture a whole variety of things anyway. And people do move across continents. They are explorers, but not simply in that mode.
Yeah, thank you. MJ has a question. And I mean, as she is your former advisor, I feel obliged to ask the question.
Yeah.
So you're talking about travel literature. She would be interested in hearing more about travel writing as a genre of personal narrative that shows patterns of variation across time and space. Maybe you could talk a bit more about patterns you've noticed, patterns in the narratives. What are the plots of traveler stories? How do they learn about what is supposed to be included? And how does this vary cross-culturally? So I think she wants you to talk a little bit. I mean, do you see your narratives as belonging to a genre, or are there multiple genres?
Again, it's an excellent question. I'll be honest, it's something I can't completely explore in the book of this size and sort of scope. It's something I'm interested in, but if you look at travel writing over time, right, it's obviously very culturally sort of structured. It has to do with what publishers think people want to read, right? So one reason why there was so much fictional travel during the Enlightenment, for example, is fictional travel, the Persian letters or whatever, got you around censorship, right? And you could also, quite honestly, make it a little more titillating for an audience that you were hoping to sell books, right? Some of these people were making livings selling books, like Mark Twain.
Mhm.
Twain was very conscious of what he needed to say about the common man's experience as a way to sort of make people interested in coming to his shows and then reading his books. In general, MJ, I mean, I think the arc is, if you look at travel writing, it was often in the early 1500s, 1600s, often very depersonalized. It was about the description of the place, if you will. Modern travel writing is much more about a personal exploration, right? I at the end of the book, I use Pico Iyer, The Global Soul. It's a book about his air travel, and whether this is leading to community or modern alienation, right? But the whole point of, in some ways, of using Pico Iyer is it's an exploration into the global soul, but his individual soul. And what does he think travel is telling us about who we are as people and our sense of connectivity, right? So travel writing, as it goes over time, moves from descriptive, often of the out, to personal adventure in the 19th century, to much more sort of introspective, travel is about how it changes us, and not only about the place we see.
Yeah, that's really very interesting. Ellen Arnold has what she termed a selfish question, but I told her she should go ahead and ask it. She's writing a book for the same series on water in world history, and she wonders if you have any advice for her.
Well, yeah, that be happy, Ellen, to sort of talk to you the one thing I would say about it is they were absolutely spot on in terms of, you do this, we'll do it then, and get it out and get it going. They were incredibly professional with me in terms of that. They did not have a lot of editorial help, right? I mean, it's largely to get you up and going and to support you. And the other thing I would say is that, it's a good series in terms of getting things out there. At the end of the day, there's a real challenge as a writer to do a very concise book, to take essentially hundreds of pages and consolidate it into a couple hundred pages. But with that, they do a very good job of making these things accessible to people. If you buy the book, you'll see that the maps are not particularly good. It's because I had to draw them, right? They did not have anybody as a cartographer. So pardon my map making skills. They tended to be rather simplistic. But that also meant it was affordable. And we know in our discipline that it's really hard to get people to buy books these days because everybody says they're too expensive and we can't afford this. The beauty of this series is that it's pretty affordable. Yeah. And speaking of, and I think Clayton at some point was going to I think he sent it out in an email. If you decide to buy the book, I think there's a flyer out there somewhere that there's a discount code. So it's relatively affordable and they make them more affordable.
I think there's time for one more question, and I think I'm going to take the question and break it into two questions. Nan Sussman says, I do work on the psychological experiences of return migration. And I guess my first question for you, and then I'll ask the second question, which is not mine, actually, it's Nan's. Do you regard migrants as travelers? And then Nan's question is, do you mention this population in the book and the historical consequences?
So I certainly think migrants are travelers. And so I do have a chapter on global migration in the 19th century. Obviously the story of coming across the Atlantic. I tell the story of Chinese contract laborers going to Cuba. It's also interesting in terms of the returners. There's what they were called in Spanish, the Spanish word I won't get right, but swallows. They were in the late 19th century, they were farm laborers basically in Italy that would work Italy in the summer season, hop on a ship, go to Argentina, work Argentina in their summer season, and travel had gotten cost effective enough that farm laborers could now become global. Yeah. Thank you, Rick. That was the word I was going to try to get out and knew I wouldn't quite do that if I had to do it. So anyway, yes, I definitely consider migrants travelers. I consider refugees travelers. And at the end of the day, I think they are part of an essential story about the modern world, particularly because of the huge numbers, right, that experience that, whether forced migration or voluntary migration, right?
Thank you. You know, I think it's getting to be about time to wrap up the formal part of this. I would like to say that in a minute, I'm gonna I will, so I guess you can unmute yourselves. Anyway, if you want to hang out and talk, we will somehow figure out a way to get you unmuted. I mean, one of the real pleasures of having this book club on Zoom is, you know, I mean, your teachers from the past, but I think also your classmates from the past are here, and you know that this technology, which we've sort of grown to love and hate, makes this possible. Clayton has put a link to the book and also information about the discount code in the chat. And there actually have been a number of really interesting questions in the chat that we haven't had time to address. I do want to talk about, or to announce the next event. The next event will be March 22nd. Again, Wednesday night from 6 to 7 Central Time. And John Mezis will be talking. And Theo, I can't actually, didn't want to pronounce a Spanish word. I don't actually want to pronounce a Greek name. The title of the book is something like Athanasius Soliotis Nicolaides and Greek Irredentism, A Life in the Shadows. And he will be in conversation with Theo Stavro, and that's March 22nd. And Clayton has just put the link to that if you want to register in the chat. Okay, all right. So I guess sort of the last word is Richard Lee says, as a former historian and travel agent and longtime Californian, for what that is worth, I note California as fictional before it became a real place. Travelers have always come with strong preconceptions of what it is. So what I'd like to do is bring the formal session to an end, but to invite anyone who wants to stay